So, in my previous talks on repentance, I've talked a lot about the greatest commandments being the central guideline, right? That it's actually the perfect moral law, just like Jesus said it was, and that alignment with it is what we're called to do. That is the great work. And it gets down to very subtle everyday matters that in large part involve certain emotions. And he pointed to this too when he talked about anger and lust, that we need to get that fine tuned into our thinking and behavior in order to enter the narrow way that is in alignment with the kingdom of heaven as it manifests on earth. But getting to that subtle level would first require getting past the more obvious, or you could say gross level. But most of humanity hasn't even progressed from the more obvious gross level. And what that means specifically is that the opposite of befriending love, which is what the greatest commandments are talking about, is abuse. And the two main forms of abuse, the two most dominant and common forms of abuse, most of humanity actually thinks are okay. And so this massive amount of abuse is taking place on a daily basis, and most of humanity has been deceived into thinking it's okay. So if we think like humanity is going to evolve to a higher state, we're going to have this new earth, or, you know, redemption, salvation, and most humans aren't even following the greatest commandments in these obvious large scale ways, well then the work on a subtle level, right, is obviously going to be neglected and overpowered by the greater abuse happening on an everyday basis. Make this more clear. Jesus talked about how, yeah, of course, this violent act is a bad thing, but so is even just having, even clinging to rage or clinging to lust, right? So he was saying, this is terrible, but this is also bad, right? But if we keep accepting the terrible and think we can just move ahead to the subtle, right? That's not correct, right? That's not going to be truly bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth, right? Even if someone were to purify their mind and belief so that they never cling to anger or lust anymore, but then they were out doing some more physically harmful activities like murder, or, you know, grand theft on a large scale, which I'll be getting to is actually going on a daily basis and thought of as just fine. Would you say that person has, you know, achieved sainthood, that they've become a true disciple? Of course not. So we need both, but I think it makes sense to eliminate the easier, you know, at least intellectually, it's easier to let go of the more obvious gross levels of abuse and then work on the more complex and subtle forms, which gets into the emotions, gets into emotional intelligence. But being non-abusive towards people and animals on a gross, obvious level should be, an easy first step. But as I've spoke of earlier, most people don't actually see it as an obvious misstep in the first place. They think it's just fine because of all the propaganda that tells them so. I did a talk a while ago titled "Are Most Good People Actually Pro-Evil?" And that was actually a really important talk. I didn't expect it to become popular. I still don't expect it to ever become so. But I have seen with time that what I was sharing there is actually getting at what's actually most important for humanity as far as, quote unquote evolution. I don't actually believe in Darwinian macroevolution of one species turning into another because that's complete bunk science. But when I say evolution, I mean as far as in a spiritual or religious context, like progressing from sinning towards more virtuous thinking, speaking, and acting, right? More alignment with the greatest commandments of Yeshua HaMashiach, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, right? So there's a lot of people talking, in a religious or a spiritual context about, love is the answer and we need to be more loving. But on the two areas of greatest abuse, which is the opposite of love, right? So that would be the two areas that need the most correction as far as an increase in love. On the two most dominant areas of participation in abuse by humans, there is a conservative effort to steer everyone away from acknowledgement of these two areas as being the most dominant areas of abuse. And it's just quite incredible, just how pervasive the opposition to what should be obvious because it's just simple reasoning uh, is. So I'll just give a couple examples that I just came across, within the past 24 hours. So one was listening to a well-known like spiritual teacher, and in this talk, like in countless other talks of his, he does talk a lot about love and raising consciousness and these um, kind of ideas and this kind of language, but he never talks about the treatment of animals, and he never talks about whether our social systems are fundamentally wrong from the foundation. He did happen to mention in passing, that medical tyranny was not good and that people should have the right to choose what drugs and medical devices they use. So that was good. That was pretty exceptional because a lot of people won't even say that. But he didn't get to the root of tyranny in the first place, which is the social system, which is, the governing authorities, the ruling class that carry out the tyranny in the first place, right? So that was example number one. Number two is another guy I was listening to who was just going on and on about higher consciousness and again, returning to we need to evolve to more loving consciousness. But what was interesting was when the topic of veganism came up, and just right off the bat, I could tell it was BS because the first thing he said was, "Oh, the idea that you know we should be vegan, it's a semantic fallacy." So that it's just ridiculous if you're familiar with logical fallacy. So um, there's a fallacy called equivocation where you use a word that has two different meanings in an argument. So he tried to make that equivalent with people saying we should leave animals alone because they feel pain, have emotions, and want to live, right? It was absurd, and he never actually made the point in any kind of way. He just went off about talking about how, you know, the blood type diet makes sense to him, and he thinks he needs to eat, organ meats in order to be healthy. So, and a lot of people go for this, they just follow one BS nutrition, you know, theory after another to supposedly justify being abusive towards animals. So before, earlier in the opposition against veganism, it was, oh, well, you need B12, right? You can only get B12 from animal products. And then it turns out, oh, that's not actually true. B12 comes from bacteria, and, you can get this bacteria elsewhere. And our ancestors had it more readily because their hands were in healthy living soil on a regular basis. And so, like, the micrograms of B12 that you needed were much more readily available than in our modern industrial society with, chlorinated water and antibiotics and so on, and depleted soil, right? It's just been well debunked if you actually take a little time to look into it, and you realize, okay, it doesn't seem like we can blame a plant diet on, lack of B12, right? Even people that eat meat lack B12, right? So then you might have heard, oh, well, what about omega-3s, right? That you got to have your fish oil. You got to have that nasty, disgusting fish oil in order to get your omega-3s, right? And then people started to realize, well, wait a minute, where did the fish get the omega-3s from? Oh, they get it from algae. Oh, so I guess we could just eat the algae to start with. We don't have to eat this mercury filled, nasty fish oil from fish that feel pain, right? So we don't actually have to be abusive, it turns out, over and over again. And now the latest trend is, oh, well, you need bone broth, or you need, organs, uh, because the body needs cholesterol. And then, even though the body produces enough cholesterol on its own, it's not an essential nutrient that we need to get externally. So, I mean, these are all things that you can find out for yourself. But if you don't actually care in the first place, you're not going to, if you even come across the truth, you're just going to disregard it and lean towards whatever just suits your abusive lifestyle. And from a religious context, oh, well, in the Bible here, it says that Jesus, ate, there's this one passage that says, well, he ate a piece of fish once. And it also says in some of these translations, not all of them, but some of them mention he distributed fish. So therefore, God must not care that, these animals clearly want to live, that they have emotions, feel pain. It clearly must not matter because of these passages I discovered, right? Never mind the possibility that these passages might be incorrect, right? And then if you question them on that, oh, that can't be. This is the inerrant word of God. It's like you just fall off into nonsense right away. It's impossible that someone could have written something untrue on a piece of paper. What? Like, really? That's your justification for being abusive? It's impossible that any of these so-called authorities and, the church, the lying pen of the scribes that even true prophets spoke of, it, that doesn't exist, can't happen. All the evidence that Jesus and the original apostles abstained from meat, we'll just disregard all that, right? All those other books and all the other historical evidence that points to them actually being non-abusive towards animals, oh, that must be all false, because here we have these few passages that seem to indicate that it's okay to just be abusive to animals every day. You see what I mean? It's just a whole bunch of nonsense that's being leaned on heavy as supposed justification. It doesn't hold up, and it just shows you don't really care, and it's just one nonsensical defense of the abusive behavior after another. They might find someone who abstains from animal products but isn't in great health, and they'll say, "Well, see, therefore it must that shows." Like, I found one vegan that isn't in great health. Never mind that there's dozens of other factors along with uh, the diet, like environmental toxins, bodily toxins, returning to mercury, right? The establishment, medicine, dentists put mercury in people's teeth, and countless, hundreds of millions of people are being dosed with mercury from their own mouths every day, just as one example of, countless as far as toxins go, like, oh, heavy metal toxicity, that doesn't exist. That's not an issue. Parasites, oh, that's not an issue. Meanwhile, these are like major, major health problems in the world, right? So let's just disregard all other causes of health issues and just say, oh, it's the vegan diet. And even if they don't have other sources of an ailment, it may still not be the fault of the diet itself. They just might be doing it wrong, right? Like Oreos are vegan, but if I just ate Oreos all day, I wouldn't be healthy, right? But does that mean a vegan diet is unhealthy? No, it means a bad vegan diet is unhealthy, right? How many people know that we need about 5 grams of potassium a day? That's a lot of potassium compared to other minerals, right? 4,700 milligrams. But it's estimated that's actually good nutritionists say that's on the low end of what the body apparently really needs, and so 5 grams is a conservative, true, recommended daily allowance. But let's just stick with the 4,700 milligrams that the government says we should take. You know how hard actually it is without intention to reach 4,700 milligrams of potassium without intention, without choosing potassium-rich foods. It's not going to happen. That's why most Americans, vegan or not, are not, getting enough potassium. Same with magnesium. And then, of course, we can return to the issue of like industrialized society and how the soil is depleted, and even the foods that are supposed to be potassium rich, like apricots and avocados, aren't going to have the same amount of potassium that they had previously because of industrialization and GMOs and all the rest of the garbage that comes with, modern society. But is that a fault of the plants, right? Is that saying, oh, well, this proves that God doesn't want us to eat plants? This proves that God wants us to be abusive towards animals? No, that's ridiculous. You're just making one false equivalency after another. So, like I was saying in the original talk, the two main areas of participation are abuse towards animals and abuse towards humans, in the latter being through systems of extortion. And people just miss the forest for the trees there all the time, going on and on about one political scandal after another. Like, oh, did you hear that this went on with this politician and that? It's like none of that actually matters. Like, you really think one trading one politician for another is going to make any iota of real difference in the world when they are just talking heads for a system that's based on extortion, right? Which is based on stealing money from everybody and then basically doing whatever they want with it, and then everyone hoping for the best. Like, it's just absurd. Like, if you were just on an island or just in a small community, and it was starting from scratch, how would extortion be conceived of as the right basis for social justice? It wouldn't. It wouldn't at all, because it's unethical. It's abusive. The end. Like, it's that simple. And yet, politics just remains dominant because people have lost sight of basic ethics, which were perfectly expressed by Jesus through the greatest commandments, which again gets turned away from almost every time. It's just amazing. Even when I bring up the greatest commandments to um, like non-establishment Christians that are supposedly more devoted to the real teachings of Jesus, even they will get irate and oppositional by just pointing out what Jesus said about the greatest commandments. Like I've had, you might call like Hebrew Christians, or I forget what terminology, it doesn't matter, but Judaic Christians, that respect more or follow more of what would be considered Judaism alongside what is called Christianity. And if I point out, well, he clarified the law for us with the greatest commandments, is that is the law, that is the whole law, to love God with our whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love others and love ourselves. That actually covers everything. Like he said, it's all the teachings of the prophets and the whole law condensed into this perfect compass, this perfect moral compass for our lives. And they'll say, oh, you're preaching lawlessness, like you're an antichrist. It's just like, this is the insanity where even the supposed opposition to the mainstream church is against anyone uh, pointing to the most crucial teaching, right? Because if you miss the most crucial thing, which is to be non-abusive, it doesn't really matter what else you do, right? So that's why this whole system is just one propaganda, it's just one giant propaganda machine to steer you away from what's most important, which is simply to be more loving. But even those that are preaching love aren't really, because the two most dominant forms of abuse, they're okay with. So it's just a whole bunch of bullshit. It's just this whole global system is just one giant propaganda machine, like I said, to steer you away from the fundamental thing, which is don't be an asshole. Don't be an asshole towards animals, and don't be an asshole towards people. You know, how obvious is it that an animal wants to live and that they feel pain? It's extremely obvious. If you take a knife and stab an animal, it's clear as day. They don't like it. They run away. You know, it's not complicated. You take a fish out of the water, they clearly don't like it. And then you have the science to back it up. Yeah, they do have pain receptors, right? Unlike plants. And then where is this nutrient in their flesh, right? This never ending, this always changing uh, crucial nutrient that we need to justify this abuse. It's just a never ending series of lies to deceive you into continuing to be abusive. So, yeah, it's actually as simple as pointing out that being vegan and what you would call anarchist, a veganarchist, is actually in alignment with God's will, with the greatest commandments, which is actually what is the vehicle for our salvation, right? If you actually pay attention to what the Messiah said, he said, you need to, love me as I loved you. And the way you love me is you obey my commandments. And then he said what the commandments were: to love God, others, and ourselves. Is committing extortion against others loving? No. So therefore, we shouldn't do it. And if we didn't, we wouldn't have this giant, you know, empire pyramid system of abuse, all over the world. We wouldn't have socialism slash communism in, various shades all over the world. We wouldn't have the killing of, billions of trillions of animals, and then all the environmental and human health negative consequences that go with it. The world would clearly be a much better place if we follow the greatest commandments of the Messiah, but people don't think these are violations of the greatest commandments, and so they continue on. And so if the two main violations, if the two greatest violations continue on like they're no big deal, and they get you just distracted on all these other things that are of lesser importance, well, the world is still going to be mostly evil, and so things are going to still be mostly bad, and things are going to still, mostly go in a bad direction as they are. It's that simple. So, again, I recognize this is going to not make sense and seem too extreme and blah 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 to many people, and I'm fine with that. I don't expect I don't expect any more than maybe a handful of people to really hear what I'm saying. That's not why I put out these talks. I'm not doing this to, I'm not making money off of this. I'm not doing it for popularity or anything like that. It's just to have one voice actually speaking. I'm putting out there what I wish I heard others saying, but they're not. So, it's like more of a personal feeling of a sense of responsibility. Like someone has to just say the plain truth and speak against all of this deception and propaganda that's just constantly deceiving people into thinking that, oh, this isn't really that bad. You know, if we didn't support governments, well, then there'd be chaos. It's just the most ridiculous thing. Guess what actually causes the most chaos in the world? Giving people unnatural amounts of power, giving them a monopoly on violence. That's setting up chaos. Oh, we can't commit extortion against each other. We can't disarm each other. We can't push drugs on each other. Oh, but you can. We'll let you do that, and we'll just stand back and see what happens. That's a recipe for chaos, right? Letting people violate the moral law, giving them authority to, right? Legitimizing abuse is actually a recipe for chaos. And that's what statism is. It's not anarchism, which is no rulers, meaning no ruling class given the authority to abuse. That's a recipe for less chaos. So it's just completely flipped. They got everyone brainwashed into thinking, oh, setting up this system of abuse is going to result in less chaos, when logically you could reason that it wouldn't. But then we also have all the history and current events showing it to us right in our face. Never ending chaos, never ending war and deceptions and tyranny and state sponsored terrorism over and over and over again. Psy warfare, just constantly, psyops, one after another, just messing up the minds and communities in countless places, breeding chaos, right? That's what tyranny actually does. It's not the absence of a ruling class or anarchy that would do that. And you think if you leave animals alone, oh, again, the amount of bullshit is just incredible. Oh, it's a giant conspiracy. And I'm not saying there isn't, garbage, I guess you could say, versions of veganism where they're pushing genetically modified foods and whatnot, but have some discernment. Genesis 1:29, these plants are your food. Why are you going to, again, just jump on this false equivalency train of stupidity and say, oh, if someone's pro-vegan and they're pro-Bill Gates and they're pro-GMO and blah, blah, and they're this and that, and they want us to eat bugs or whatever. Obviously, eating bugs wouldn't be vegan, but you get my point. They just go off on this tangent, which is not having like an organic vegetable garden, an organic fruit orchard, nut trees in your backyard, right? That's suddenly not a possibility. It's got to be, it's just like I said, one fallacy after another. They do these false dichotomies. Oh, well, it's either we eat animals and continue to slaughter them every day, or we got to have this, dystopian GMO craziness. Right? No, that's stupid. Obviously, there's another choice, which is just having an organic garden and an orchard. So I know my thoughts were a bit all over the place, but hopefully I kept hitting on the crucial points often enough and clear enough to make this valuable to one or two people out there. All right, thank you for listening. And returning to the so-called Apostle Paul, once you realize what the two main violations of the commandments are by humanity, then you can revisit Paul's letters and notice, just like all these modern day teachers who seem good because they're talking about love, and just like you can point to verses in the letters of Paul that sound good, but yet on the two most important issues, notice what their stance is. They're okay with the two main forms of abuse continuing. In Romans 13, Paul specifically says paying your taxes is good. Paying your taxes is doing God's will. He also says, slaves obeying their masters. And yes, he is talking about like actual slaves, like on a plantation slave, in chains slave, obeying a master like that is also God's will, right? So the extortion is okay, slavery is okay, and he also was arguing with the true apostles about restrictions on meat eating. What do you know? So he was for letting go of restrictions on the abuse of animals, and he was for, being okay with the abuse of systems of extortion. So it's just one giant propaganda sandwich. If you just pay attention to the bread and be like, oh, well, in Ephesians, blah, 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 he said this really nice thing. So I'm just going to ignore all this immoral and amoral garbage that goes against what the Messiah taught, right? And what his brother James taught. The book of James, which is really just a letter of James in the New Testament, is like a complete refutation of Galatians, with where he's just going on about, faith alone, blood power, versus actual obedience to the commandments, which is what Jesus said we need to do, right? Stop sinning, love him by obeying his commandments, have exceedingly high righteousness, be perfect like our heavenly Father is perfect, right? So that's how you can spot these false prophets, is that on what's most important, they're going to steer you away, right? So whether it's a modern day spiritual teacher or this ancient false apostle, when it comes to not being abusive towards humanity on a grand scale and not being abusive towards animals on a grand scale, they're going to not only be silent, but they're going to oppose not doing those things. They're going to say, oh no, we have to. We have to, you know. If we didn't eat the liver of a cow or whatever, we would all be malnourished and die, right? If we didn't uh, have extortion, well, then we couldn't have any security. It's impossible to form any kind of security group without extortion, right? Just moronic. Right? Like, you have no basis for your argument. It's just garbage. We can't have security without the insecurity of setting up a ruling class with a monopoly on violence and the right to commit extortion on everybody. Oh yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. It's just stupid. It's really dumb. And yet these people think they're smarter than someone saying, hey, this is fundamentally wrong. We should probably stop doing this. Or we should definitely stop doing this, right? So, just a heads up. Are they for the system? Are they for the mass abuse of people? And are they for carnism, the mass abuse of animals? And, just tell you, oh, it's natural. We're an omnivore. It's okay. Even though our bodies actually match herbivores closest, right? Even though there isn't actually some, special super nutrient in the bodies of animals that we have to put in our mouths in order to be healthy. Even though it's just a pile of bullshit that they're feeding you. All right, I'll leave it there.